In the second season of the cartoon show Teen Titans, viewers are introduced to a character by the name of Terra. She's a lonely girl with geokinetic abilities, or rock and earth powers. The show reveals that Terra struggles with controlling her powers. She lets one of the Teen Titans, named Beast Boy, in on the fact that since she can't control them, she often ends up hurting the people she cares about, and then must move on from them. And almost immediately after she tells him this, she ends up slightly injuring Beast Boy. An accident that proves her point, even though he tells her that it wasn't a problem. Throughout a handful of episodes in the second season, we witness Terra continuing to struggle with her powers. She leaves for a while because her powers ended up making a bigger mess of things. And even when she comes back with greater control, she ends up hurting her fellow Titans. Because the reason why she had learned to better control her powers was because she'd fallen for the lure of the Teen Titans' primary antagonist, Slade. This villain continued to whisper into Terra's ear that if she didn't learn to control her abilities, that she'd push the Titans away, or hurt even more people. They'd all leave her and she'd be alone. Again. Slade used Terra as a spy, as payment for his lessons in control. And once her cover had been blown, she started working with Slade completely, with her previous teammates, especially Beast Boy, cut to the heart because of the betrayal. But as the season neared its end, Terra began to realize that she'd been wrong to join Slade, but his plans had gone too far. Incredible devastation, in part due to her powers, was about to be inflicted upon a great number of people. And with one final act of defiance against Slade, Terra heroically sacrifices herself to save others. Although this story arc has a tiny bit of good at the end, Terra's story follows what's referred to as a negative character arc, or a tragic arc, depending upon whom you ask to describe the flow of narrative. Either way, this type of story arc involves a character who has some character flaw or misbelief, and, given different circumstances, could have overcome this flaw in order to have a positive or heroic character arc. But as the narrative unfolds, they lean more and more into their flaw, or their misbelief. Each successive failure to overcome pushes them deeper into tragedy. For Terra, her misbelief was that she'd always end up hurting those closest to her, which would leave her being alone. But because she refused to realize the Titan's acceptance despite her flaws, she pushed them away further, leading her to be alone. Until Slade used a promise of overcoming her lack of control by separating her from the other Titans. Because of this, she ended up hurting her teammates through the betrayal. And even her death, heroic though it may be, still ended with her sending off the Titans so that she could face the disaster alone. Her death leaving a lasting mark on them, especially Beast Boy. The more that a tragic character leans into their misbelief or tries to push out of it in the wrong way, the deeper into the lie they fall. This is the essence of a tragic character. In a way, all four of the character arcs we've been following as we've been through the Book of Samuel, in our series called A Song of Failures and Hope, they're all, in a way, tragic. All four of the men, Eli, Samuel, Saul, David, they begin their arcs with promise of hope for the people of Israel, that goodness and restoration from God would come upon the people through them. But because of certain mistakes and failings in their lives, that hope fell to failure. Eli put his earthly family ahead of his spiritual family, and paid the cost of his life, plus the lives of his sons on the same day, because of it. Samuel fell into some of the same sins as Eli, allowing his sons to abuse their societal place because of him. And because of this, the Israelites end up refusing that leadership for an earthly king. Although Samuel's story arc isn't as tragic as Eli's, because he'd anoint both Saul and David as king, it still has the negative arc of failing to live up to the hope of restoration for God's humble people. Skipping ahead of Saul for right now, because his declining story arc takes center stage in our passage for the sermon, 1 Samuel chapter 28, we come to David, who is still in his rising hope stage in our series. And although he's probably the best of these four, the fact that he still fails to be the hope of God's humble people for restoration leads us to see that the story arc is less than positive. Although it is through his descendant Jesus that our ultimate hope comes. Circling back around to Saul, we have seen this king of Israel rise and do good things in the name of God. But because he so often allowed his desire for a good rating in public opinion to drive his actions, Saul pushed the work of God to the side whenever it conflicted with his flaw. And although there have been several failings shown throughout the chapters of this book, Saul's failure in completely destroying the Amalekites and their possessions is the epitome of this tragic misbelief. Each time he wanted to look good in the eyes of the Israelites, he pushed God and his work further and further away. I mean, all of his attempts to kill David come about because people liked the younger man more. Or at least they seemed to like him more, as Saul saw it. the flawed belief that Saul was only as good as the public's opinion of him, instead of God's opinion as chosen representative, continued to eat at him as he fell further into failure. And as we draw ever closer to the end of Saul's story arc, we come to a chapter in which Saul is the primary character, even as his tragic flaw continues to whisper lies in his head, pushing him further from godliness. The name David only appears in the background of Saul's story for this chapter. Saul truly is the perspective character for it. Speaking of the background, we find it in 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 1 to 3. In those days the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel, and Achish said to David, "Understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army." David said to Achish, "Very well, you shall know what your servant can do." And Achish said to David, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and necromancers out of the land. Lots of background this time. Remember the last sermon? David and his men had gone to the Philistine city of Gath, and played the undercover agents who worked against God's enemies, even while acting like they were making themselves a stench to the Israelites. But that plan worked so well that they were conscripted as mercenaries in this war against the Israelites. And David was to fight right beside King Achish himself. The description almost leads us to believe that David and Saul will be facing each other in battle against each other. At the very least, there's some added dramatic tension here. And then we get a repeated mention of Samuel's death. It's not that the author forgot that he'd already put that event in the book, or that he messed up in his chronology. No, this is something more like how A Christmas Carol begins with the words, "Marley was dead to begin with." Trust me, it's repeated for a different kind of dramatic effect. And finally, the end of verse 3 tells us that once upon a time, Saul had driven all of the mediums and necromancers out of the land of Israel. While the Israelites had been told by God to not seek out such summoners of spirits, in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 31, and the Israelites should stone these spiritists to death, according to Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27, it's not directly clear if Saul drove such people out of the land for the sake of God's command, or if there were other reasons. The passage merely mentions the fact that he had driven them out. Oh, and when it comes to these two types of spiritists, because they're so often paired, and one is a feminine word while the other is a masculine word, it would appear that both performed the same or similar rituals, but were just the terms for the feminine and masculine versions. Such people would claim to use the spirits of the dead in order to divine the future, which is what necromancer literally means, since the mancer ending comes from a word for divination of the future, not just the person who has magic related to whatever the word is prefixed to the mancer part. Alright, so with knowledge that the Philistines waged a full-on offensive against Israel, there's the drama of David and his men as mercenaries against Israel, Samuel was dead to begin with, and Saul had driven spiritists from the land of Israel. With all of that said, we can begin the scene as Saul's negative story arc draws nearer to its end. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 4 to 11. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, or by Urim, or by the prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servants said to him, "Behold, there is a medium at Endor." So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night, and he said, "Divine for me a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you." The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death?" But Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He said, "Bring up Samuel for me." It seems that for this major offensive against Israel that the Philistines were quite a bit north of their typical stomping grounds. I mean, they were closer to the Sea of Galilee than the Dead Sea that's on Judah's eastern border. And since the Philistine cities were on Judah's western border, that's a long way from home to wage a war. Some scholars question if they were trying to cut off Saul from part of the nation, as if they could divide the Israelite army before trying to squash this menace that wouldn't lie down as easily as the rest of the people from the land of Canaan. But either way, the Philistines were on one side of the valley, and the Israelites were on the other side. And then looking at the Philistine army made Saul shake in his armor. Not just pre-battle jitters, but full-on fear. The outcome was unclear to him, and he didn't know how to approach the battle. He'd hoped that some dream from God could be given to him, or that a roll of the godly divining instruments made by whatever priest dared to still be near him would tell him what to do, or that some prophet would speak a word from the Lord. But through all of this, there was no answer. Saul had made himself an enemy of God by rejecting God's commands, so God treated the king as an enemy. I'm sure that Saul thought to himself, I wish that Samuel were still alive right now. Whenever he was around, I always led the people to victory. But without him, I'm directionless. And I don't want the people to see me fail in this important moment. His flaw of thinking that all he needed to do was ask God, despite his incessant rejection of God's commands, feeding him the lie that if he only had Samuel around, then he could save face in front of the people, lead them to victory, and be liked by them again. Attempt after attempt of getting what he'd had while Samuel was still with him went through his mind, but all to no effect. The Lord refused to answer, direction far from his grasp. All he had was a sword in his hand and a massive army ahead of him with a less mighty army behind him. No wonder he was fearful. When we try to do things only under our own power, there will come an end to our strength, a failed heart, a fearful spirit, and thrashing directions that lead us to places that we never thought we'd ever think were good ideas. We find ourselves in negative character arcs that only deepen our flaw, instead of leading us to the heroes we could have been, if only we had joined God in his restorative work. So because Saul wanted a victory for the people that he led, and the heightened public opinion that would come along with it, he sent out feelers for a way to be able to speak with Samuel once again. In an effort to get direction from God, Saul turned to something so opposed to godliness that God had directly commanded its destruction. Saul's flaw of seeking others' opinion pushed him further from the only opinion that actually mattered for his job. A tragic character, indeed. Giving word to a handful of his closest advisors, Saul asked for knowledge of where to find a medium. And when one was found in Endor, and no, she wasn't an Ewok, Saul went there. Now, for we who don't know the geography of Israel, the symbolism here flies right past us. Here was a battle line. On one side were the people of God, those who were supposed to represent him in this world. And on the other side were the Philistines, those who consistently throughout the book were the epitome of the enemies of God, evil incarnate as far as the book is concerned. Saul purposefully crossed that line between the people of God and the enemies of God. See, Endor was past the Philistine encampment. Saul had to physically and metaphorically cross over the line to God's enemy's side in order to reach this medium in Endor. Saul was in so many ways on the wrong side of this battle. His obsession of looking good in front of those he led and their opinion of him left him lost from the direction of his call as God's chosen king, a tragedy clear to all who watch. Before he reached the medium, Saul and a couple of soldiers with him put on disguises and came to the medium's location under the cover of night. Not only was that supposedly the best time for such spiritists to ply their trade, but it also aided in the disguise, a self-disgust that Saul had at going this far for something he thought he deserved. Whether or not the medium recognized Saul, or saw some armament of Israelite soldiers, she at first denied his request to raise a spirit. She reiterated the fact that Saul had driven out spiritists like that. Surely you know what Saul did, right? So why would you come here for such a thing? You won't find any mediums here. Notice in verse 10 how far Saul is in his misbelief that he is deserving of God's direction. While assuring the medium that nothing will happen to her for doing her necromancy, Saul vows on the name of Yahweh. The two things are so diametrically opposed that they don't belong anywhere near each other, let alone in the same sentence. But Saul had fallen so far into tragedy that he doesn't even see it. With that, the woman admits to being a medium by asking whom he wants to raise. And Saul names Samuel. I question whether or not the hackles of the medium went up right there and then. Why would this person want to talk to the great prophet of Israel? But she went along with it regardless. And Samuel had a message that Saul wouldn't like. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 12 to 19. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, Why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, Do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a god coming up out of the earth. And he said to her, What is his appearance? And she said, An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me. And God has turned away from me, and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I should do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me? Since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy. The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines." Without getting too much into it, because knowledge of ungodly rituals should not be fully described in a sermon, or be known by God's people, similar ritualistic practices from Greek, Mesopotamian, and Hittite writing show us that the way this event likely went down was that the medium dug a hole in the dirt, spoke some ritualistic words, and poured blood in the hole. All of this in order to raise the dead. And the medium was supposedly the only one who could see the spirit because of a particular ointment that they wiped under their eyes. This is why Saul asks in verse 13, "What do you see?" He wasn't supposed to be able to see the spirit, according to the typical medium's practice. Although I wonder if the particulars of this moment did eventually allow Saul to see Samuel. And before we get too involved in the specifics of the passage, I feel it's necessary to at least mention something about the nature of this necromantic moment, and those otherwise practiced by such spiritists. Honestly, different biblical scholars throughout history have disagreed about the presence of Samuel's spirit here. Some say that it was just a demonic spirit taking on the image of Samuel, because they say that the practice can do nothing but raise evil spirits. Others just skim right past the events, in an effort to not have to figure out this unique moment. And still more say that typical rituals by mediums are nothing but hoaxes, and that the medium's scream was because she was surprised that it had actually worked. Regardless of which side you come down on, at the very least, what we can say is that no follower of Jesus should play around with magic divinations of any sort. God's pretty clear about his position on that. And while what this Samuel says aligns with the prophet's words while alive, and God's words, including a prophesied death of Saul and his sons, which mirrors the prophet's own words to Eli and his sons earlier in the book, this, at the very least, would be a singular event of God's allowance to speak through a medium's work, to someone too belligerent to understand why God was ghosting him. If God could speak through a donkey to a different belligerent individual in the book of Numbers, then God can speak in other extraordinary means here. If God wants to speak to us when we're not willing to hear the truth of his words, he can get our attention however he wants. And throughout all of this, remember that this is a negative character arc for Saul, as he reaches ever deeper into his villainous turn. This is certainly not something to copy. Anyway, back to the passage. When the woman saw Samuel's spirit, she realized that Saul stood before her, her fear matching Saul's own that led him to this moment. But when Saul demanded a description, she said that she saw a god coming up out of the ground into the hole dug for him. Her use of the term god here definitely doesn't mean that she's calling Samuel a god now. Rather, this would show us how much of a pagan understanding had been incorporated into her practice, because often the little statues referred to as household gods were carved into the shape of dead relatives. Thus, because of the connection of the spirit world with the dead relatives, at least as far as this type of paganism sees it, a familial spirit would be synonymous with the household gods of the family. While the term she uses is God, she's just referring to the type of spirit that she supposedly should be able to see. When Saul demands a description, the woman describes Samuel as he was in his old age, and the specific garment of his prophetship that was synonymous with him. So when Saul was convinced that this was indeed the Samuel he wanted to hear from, he bowed to the ground, and Samuel asked Saul what he wanted. The king lays out the problem. Philistines at war, no word from God, no dream, no prophecy, no nothing but fear. So Saul came to hear from Samuel. And this Samuel scoffs at Saul. "Why come to the prophet of God when Yahweh himself has turned from you, Saul? What, you think just because I'm here he'll answer you? He's not that easily deceived, O king. Do you really think that God provides good answers for those opposed to him?" Everything's going exactly the way that Samuel had told Saul so long ago. Back with the Amalekites, Saul rejected God's command, so God rejected Saul, and had been at odds with him ever since, even tearing the kingdom from Saul's hands and giving it to David. Notice that dig at Saul's flaw. The people had seemed to like David more. And now those very people will be given to David instead of Saul. The public opinion that he had so eagerly craved would turn to David after all. Saul had failed at what he wanted because his heart did not align with God. And not only that, this battle would be won by the Philistines. Israel itself will be defeated by their enemy, and Saul and his sons will die on the same day. I know that I already drew attention to this detail, but I can't help but see how closely Saul's death mirrors Eli's. Father and sons prophesied to die on the same day because of a battle. Both Eli and Saul had put people ahead of God. Eli put his sons themselves above God, and Saul put himself, specifically through the public opinion of the people, above God. And both found tragic ends. While I hope that none of us find such a dramatic end, let's keep these warnings in mind when we're tempted to seek something other than God's work and opinion above all else. That's not to say that we place God's work so far ahead that it's detrimental to our other responsibilities, but it does mean that we should, in love, call out people who should know better than to act so ungodly, and not fear the outcries of our peers when they pressure us to give in to the ungodly ways of life. Who should we want to please more? The God who made us, died for us, and calls us to be his family? Or the fickle people who will leave us at the first sign of another option? Those who redefine their terms on such regularity that even they can hardly keep up with the changes? Which one do you think we should want to please more? The difference between a positive character arc and a negative one always comes down to a difficult choice between reaching out for what's best for us or striving for what we think we need. The heroic truth or the tragic lie. These choices define our path and can mean the difference between life and death. I know that these words are hard to hear, and many will struggle to even move because of their weight. That's what happened to Saul after he realized that he'd gotten on the track to a negative character arc, and there was no getting out of it now. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 20 to 25. Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he'd eaten nothing all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, Behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now therefore you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. He refused and said, I will not eat. But his servants together with the woman urged him, and he listened to their words. So he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly killed it, and she took flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. Deep depression hit Saul at these words. Everything he'd hoped to have, all of the strivings for a positive public opinion, they were all for nothing. He'd made the wrong choice so long ago, and now it seemed like there was no going back. So he fell to the ground without any desire to continue. The fighting had all been for nothing. Some may question, could Saul have repented right then and found favor with God? I personally believe that it's never too late, as long as we're alive, to repent and turn to our God and King, Jesus. But I also know that some people have hardened their heart to God for so long that even when face to face with an option of his forgiveness, they swat the hand away. I don't know the ultimate end of anybody, let alone Saul. But this story does continue to speak to us about making sure that we turn to God long before that possibility of too hard of a heart ever comes into our minds. This call to heed God's commands, keep them in our hearts and minds instead of the things of this world. This call is so urgent, for we never know when our end will come. The loneliness that Saul chose for himself hits him as he refuses to eat, even though he needs to. There's a battle coming, and he's to lead it. Even if he will die in the effort, he needs to lead. So the woman slaughters a calf for him to eat, and I wonder how much Saul thought about himself being like that fattened calf, led to the slaughter. After the food, the small company returned with the truth hanging darker than the night in which they traveled. Those who refuse to heed the commands of God often realize too late that they've made a mistake. They grow the misbelief instead of overcoming it. They let the flaws fester and deny any intervention to fight it. That misbelief looked so good. Exactly what we wanted. But that's the thing about a misbelief. It leads us to a tragic end that we never saw coming. All because we refused to realize what it was that we truly needed. Tragedy and misbelief go hand in hand. They are a part of negative character arcs that could have been heroic if only we'd have realized sooner. If only. I hope that these words are a wake-up call to those hearing them. What is it in our lives that's fighting to deny, obfuscate, and destroy the truth of God? What is the misbelief that we must overcome? Each of us will have different answers, because we all have unique situations. But one thing that the book of Samuel can teach us is that it often starts with those little choices for the sake of the people around us, the moments where we look to people instead of the ways of God. Look to where you've given in just that little bit, where you let slackness reign instead of godliness, and I'm sure you'll find the place that the misbelief lies. Let us seek to find and overcome our misbeliefs before we have to ask if there is such a thing as too late. And we don't have to be alone in the process of overcoming, because we have a Savior who has overcome the world, overcome every pressure and misbelief and lie and flaw, overcome whatever ours is. He can lead us to the positive character arc He has for us. If only we listen, obey, and submit to His ways.